Okay, sorry for the interruption. Please continue.
Not at all. Yeah, so I'm originally from Karachi, which is sort of Pakistan's largest city. Thankfully, the urban areas have largely been shielded from the flooding. Now, sort of in the post-flooding phase, the urban areas are sort of taking a hit in a different way. I shouldn't call it a hit, but like they're being affected in a different way in terms of because of the massive internal migration. So you have a lot of IDPs, internally displaced persons, who have basically nowhere to go. So they are migrating to any urban areas that are in the closest vicinity. And this has been true of previous crises as well, whether it's been flooding, earthquakes, even during conflicts and wars. So what I thought I'd do this evening is to first give you a context in which this climate tragedy occurred in Pakistan. Unfortunately, it wasn't and isn't the only crisis that the country is going through right now. There's a whole list of crises happening, so take your pick as to which we want to address. So my hope is to sort of ideally give you sort of a before, present, and aftermath of the floods. And since you're on Zoom, I thought I'd take advantage of this, and everyone lives a good PowerPoint. So I'll if it's all right with you, I'd just briefly share that, and hopefully I won't bore you too much. And I'm ideally hoping that we can actually have a discussion, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the group might have. So I'll try to see if I can share my screen. Oh yes, it allows me to do that. Can everyone see the screen? There should be a map of Pakistan.
Yes.
I'll try to see, should I actually sort of go full screen, or is this perfect?
Full screen might be good.
Let's see.
That'll make it bigger, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me stop share for a second and let's see. Full screen. And to Zoom, share. Is this better? Somewhat?
We're still seeing your web browser, not the.
Oh.
Oh, actually, oh yeah, it is better. Maybe you can go to full screen with the green, the little green circle.
Let me try this again. Let's see. I think if I do slideshow, I lose Zoom. But if I mean,
you can go back to that if you want. I mean, I think we can read it. It's just, yeah.
Is this better, or is this too zoomed in?
I think that's good.
That's fine. That's good.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can.
Oh, right here.
I'll go ahead with this if this is if this seems fine and not too zoomed in. As you can probably make out, I'm not too tech savvy. But yeah, so I thought I'd begin with sort of a map of the country because I'll keep coming back to this to sort of give you a sense of. I'm just gonna take this back to. Sorry about this. 100 and to give you a sense of like which provinces have been sort of the hardest hit, where the situation is relatively better. So Pakistan, like the US, is actually a federalist country. So there are four main provinces: Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in the northwest, which we call KP. And then there are a host of sort of smaller areas. A lot of them are federally autonomous. They come under the federal government, but the day-to-day running is essentially conducted by either tribes or the local setup. And I can tell you outright that the provinces that have been most effective are actually Sindh in the south, where I'm from. So I'm from Karachi, right in the south, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in the northwest. Yeah, so KP and Sindh, and just move on to sort of, and I was having this conversation with Brian earlier this afternoon, actually, as to what the situation is right now. So I took this from this morning US time. So this is actually from, I think, 6 p.m. Pakistan time. And as of today, the situation is, according to the federal authorities in Pakistan, the situation is quote unquote normal flow. The situation has normalized. It's now a question of where the water has receded from and where it hasn't, how much the soil is waterlogged. But essentially the flow of the water in the rivers is normal. The other reason why I sort of put up this picture is to give you an idea of what the river system in Pakistan is like. So as you can see, the bulk of the rivers actually run in a north to south direction, which means that they run right throughout the country. There's a small sort of group of rivers in the northwest of the country that runs from east to west, but most of them are running from north to south. Some of them actually right on the eastern side of the country actually come from India. There's a lot of international political power play involved as well, which I'm happy to get into in the Q&A. But yeah, so thankfully the situation has normalized today. But again, normalized is a relative term. This is just to give you an idea of, this was published on August 23rd, I think. So we were still pretty much in the heart of the flooding issue. This is rainfall from July through August 23rd. So this does not capture the entire bulk of the monsoon season, just up till August 23rd. And after August 23rd, we essentially had, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks of further rainfall. This only exacerbated. Again, you can see particularly in this Sindh province in the south, there was more than usual rainfall, and I'll get to the specific sort of the climate change itself in just a moment. And again, please feel free to stop me if I'm going too fast, if I'm going too slow. If you have any questions about any particular slide, I'm happy to pause and answer. So just to give you a little bit context, as I said, unfortunately, this wasn't the only crisis that Pakistan was going through. There was intense and extremely acrimonious political upheaval happening at this time. So you have provincial elections happening, you have rallies happening, you have long marches. And this is a particular favorite of Pakistan. Pakistanis, I should say, political long marches onto the capital. You had political fights being played out in high courts and the Supreme Court of the country. It's a messy situation. And if you have been following Pakistani politics in around earlier this year, there was a change in government. Again, a very acrimonious change in government that is still being fought today. And I'll get to that right at the end of my presentation as to why it matters for the flooding crises, this sort of political upheaval. There was also intense provincial federal disunity, which again, I'll get to how it matters for the flooding crises at the end. Essentially, two of the provinces, Punjab, which is the sort of the richest province, and KP, which is one of the hardest hit provinces, hardest hit with the floods, they actually belong to the opposition. So they're not in the hands of the federal government of the country. And I'll sort of mention why the impact this has had. The economy was, to put it mildly, in shambles. The US dollar to Pakistani rupee exchange rate was, I mean, it was around 240 rupees to a dollar, which is the highest, which is the weakest the rupee has been relative to the dollar. You had rising fuel prices, you had shortage of fuel. So think about Sri Lanka-like conditions. Sri Lanka at this time basically ran out of fuel. And this was almost happening in parallel at this time. And so there was a sort of genuine fears that Pakistan was headed the same way, that there would be essentially the country would run out of fuel. There would be severe fuel shortages, food shortages. The country would essentially go down the road of bankruptcy. There was severe inflation. So when I was there, for instance, the price of a small loaf of bread was 90 rupees. By the time I left, which was, I was there for like 2 to 3 months, it had risen to 110 rupees. So imagine like someone who earns, let's say, 500 rupees a day. Imagine spending more than 1/5 of it for a small loaf of bread. I'm not talking about the healthy US size. I'm talking about a very, very small, let's say 10 to 12 slices of bread. So quite expensive. And then amidst all of this, as if this wasn't enough, you had a very genuine threat of resurgence of the Pakistani Taliban in the northwest. So again, going back to this map, so in this region, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in KP, which along with Sindh was the hardest hit, you're now having a serious threat of basically the Pakistani Taliban resurging and sort of threatening the government's control and threatening essentially the people. So all in all, this was, there's no right time for a tragedy, but if there was a bad time, this is it. This was sort of the worst time that the flooding could have picked to happen. And so imagine all of this, and now imagine what I'm going to tell you about the flooding. So sort of a nightmare scenario. So this was the term that the Pakistani government itself used: climate-induced humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. According to the NDMA, so Pakistan has sort of, NDMA is the National Disaster Management Authority. It's a federal level authority. So the amount of rain that Pakistan received just in the month of August was an increase of 241%. So we're really talking about a massive increase from what Pakistan is used to. Sindh and Balochistan. Balochistan, by the way, is the largest province of Pakistan. It's also the poorest province of Pakistan. So Sindh and Balochistan were the worst hit. We're talking about increases in rain and in monsoon deluge of, let's say, around 800 and 500% respectively. So these are like massive, massive increases. We're not just talking about a 50 to 100% increase. These are, I mean, really massive increases. And essentially, unfortunately, not that soon into the crises, Pakistan at the federal level established, as the Minister for Climate Change called, a war room, sort of an emergency crisis room to deal with the situation, to deal with carrying out search and rescue operations, deliver food, deliver medicines, rebuild sort of the emergency infrastructure and so on. And I think this is the fact that really stood out for me, and I mean, really points out to climate change being very real, first of all, and happening not tomorrow, not day after tomorrow, but today. In fact, I mean, as Brian pointed out at the start of the session, this is sort of like this has been happening for months now. So this is sort of a in the past almost now, and we're already sort of watching out for the next crises to hit. So, I mean, Pakistan is used to 3 to 4 cycles of monsoon rain in its wettest year. So not in an ordinary year, in a sort of a really wet, really rainy year, 3 to 4 monsoon cycles. This year, there were 8 cycles of monsoon rains. So imagine that, 8 cycles. 8 cycles is, I've never seen anything like this growing up in Pakistan. In fact, I'll share a personal sort of story. I remember growing up, my brother and I used to pray for rain in Karachi, because in a wet year, Karachi would have sort of a 1 week of rain. And we used to pray for it because we enjoyed playing in the rain, in the puddles, and playing cricket in the rain. And this was the year when I actually distinctly remember praying for the rain to stop, because, I mean, even in Karachi, the rain was just, Karachiites had never seen anything like this. It was just rain, 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 all days of the week. Every day it was, you just couldn't go outside. And I'm talking about Karachi, which might not have the best infrastructure, but at least it has some infrastructure. So imagine what the situation was like in the rural areas where there's almost little to no infrastructure. And so the flooding situation essentially started, let's say, in the second week of July. But it really took a while for Pakistanis, myself included, to actually realize the gravity of the situation. And it wasn't until August 25, I think, August 25th, when the government actually declared a federal national emergency. So the government took, let's say, well over a month to declare the situation to be an emergency. And by that time, as I'll get to in a moment, the damage had already been done. Most of the damage had happened actually before the government declared the national emergency. Most of the damage happened in the later part of July and early part of August. And the government goes on and declares the emergency to be on August 25th. And I don't know if these might be interesting, but I thought I'd share these anyway. These are from August 26th, so a day after the government declares a national emergency, essentially warning that there's a high to very high flood level chance in River Indus. So imagine, like, the government is issuing these on August 26th. The flooding and the damage has already been happened by this time. So there's an obvious lag, obvious time delay in the flooding itself, the damage that it did, and the time that it took for the government to realize what the situation was on the ground. Similarly, this is I'm not sure if you can read the the font. I apologize for that. But this is essentially for River Kabul, which is actually one of the smaller east to west rivers running in the northwest of the country. Again, it says very high to exceptionally high level of flooding expected in River Kabul. And this is, again, from August 26th. So we are talking about the time when the flooding, the peak of the flooding has essentially happened. And it took the government for a variety of reasons, a long time to realize the gravity of the situation. So think about the slide of context, which I showed you. And this was partially the reason why it took a long time for the government to realize the situation, the gravity of the situation, because there was just a whole lot to deal with, unfortunately. How am I doing on time? I hope I'm not too fast or slow. I found this really interesting. This is roughly from 6 years ago. And it's an article that the Washington Post actually published. And I was not aware of this fact, but Pakistan, outside the polar regions, it has the most glaciers in the world, the most number of glaciers. And 6 years ago, this article came basically pinpointing that Pakistani glaciers are at risk. And guess what? 6 years down the lane, I would say almost nothing has been done. And it's this melting of glaciers that are sort of an alarming risk that has been responsible for part of the flooding that has happened. I won't go into, I'm happy to come back to this. It's basically the last severe flooding that had happened was in 2010. And I can come back to this in Q&A, but essentially there's many parallels between 2010, which was 12 years ago, and the present sort of flooding crises. The areas impacted have changed slightly, but essentially sort of imagine the same extent of flooding: lives lost, livestock lost, people living out in the ocean, open, lots of waterborne diseases, food shortage, and so on. I mean, lots has been said about decision making in Pakistan. This was sort of a painful decision making, a decision making that, for obvious reasons, involved a lot of politics. This was essentially to cut or not to cut, and I borrowed this from an article that came in Dawn News, which is one of Pakistan's newspapers. And there was this concept of, so the flooding is happening, and so there's this concept of intentionally making what the Pakistani government is calling relief cuts or controlled cuts in dikes, essentially. And the trade-off here was how to save sort of the more populated areas at a cost of letting the lesser populated areas become inundated and submerged. And you can imagine the kind of politics that was involved here, because let's say I'm a landowner, I have good political connections, I can use them to make sure that my area is not the one that suffers from these relief cuts. And it's the other areas which might not be as politically relevant, as politically connected, that suffer. So for instance, there's this lake in Pakistan that was overflowing, and so Manchar Lake. So the government made these relief cuts in Manchar Lake, and the pretext was, the idea was, I don't know how genuine this idea was, but essentially this was what was claimed, that these cuts would save more densely populated areas. But then what happened was, because of these relief cuts, essentially 5 adjacent towns became inundated. So we're talking about around 100,000 people that were displaced, that were affected because of these relief cuts. Hopefully, I'm hoping no lives were lost because of these intentional relief cuts. They were hopefully able to evacuate in time. But nevertheless, like, people lost their homes, their livelihoods. And the idea was you were saving more people down the road. As the irrigation department claimed, that the dilemma was that basically it was a chain reaction. The river Indus was not accepting water from the lake was not accepting water from the MNVD, which is sort of a massive drain, and so that they were forced to make these cuts. But it's an interesting concept. I'm not sure how much planning went into these relief cuts. I'm hoping they were more planned than what they appeared to be at first glance. But nevertheless, there were these interesting, painful, tragic decisions that were made. And the question is, if there was a better alternative that could have been utilized or not, if this can be improved for the next year's flooding, because Pakistan is a country which unfortunately does experience flooding almost every year. The extent of that flooding differs. So this year was just massive. But hopefully lessons can be taken from this for next year. I'm not sure if this will play, but this was hopefully, can you guys see the video?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
So the reason why I included this video was this became viral. This is essentially a hotel right by River Kalam in Sawat in the northwest. That was essentially just swept away by the river, and this video became viral. And this was essentially that made people in other parts of the country, like Karachi, like Lahore, realize that, hey, this is not your every year flooding. This is something that we've never encountered before, because we're not talking about mud houses or thatched roof houses. We're talking about a multi-storied, proper concrete hotel building that was just swept away as if it wasn't even there. And now compare that to houses like these. So this is what many of the homes in rural Pakistan look like. So if that multi-story concrete building didn't stand a chance, so imagine, so you can probably imagine that such homes made out of tree trunks, leaves, would definitely stand no chance whatsoever. Moving on. This was actually, I took this from CNN. This happened when there was an earthquake in Pakistan in 2014 or 15, I believe, as well, where you had this sort of natural lake just being made. And this happened again this year as well, where with the flooding, the topography of parts of Pakistan literally changed. There was water where there wasn't supposed to be any water. And right now there's a huge 100-kilometer inland lake that is there in the south of the country, in Sindh. So how do we adapt to these new topographical changes? How do we adapt to these huge water bodies that have come up that will probably stay there for a good chunk of time for the foreseeable future? How to sort of accommodate people who used to live here, who can clearly not go back to these areas, I think is the question to tackle in the aftermath, and is a question to keep in mind for future crises as well. Moving towards trying to wrap up, so that we can move on to any questions. So, I mean, this clearly, these slides don't do justice to the crises. They clearly don't do justice to the effects of the crises, the effects of the flooding, but just to give you sort of a snapshot picture. So as Brian, I believe, already mentioned, so 33 million people were affected. I think that's exactly 15% of the 220 million strong population of the country. So we're talking about a good chunk of people, over 1,600 people killed. Unfortunately, quite a few of them with children, women. And this is not counting people killed in the aftermath. So people that died due to starvation, that died due to food shortage, diseases, that's excluding those people. A lot of people have been displaced by the floods. There are lots of IDPs. As I mentioned, there's massive internal migration. The urban areas, as big as they are, they're not equipped to deal with these IDPs. So the question is, what to do with the IDPs now? The economic impact has been estimated to be around at least 10 billion, if not more. That's around 3% of the country's GDP. And that's a lot of money by Pakistani standards. I was having this conversation with Brian earlier today. Pakistan is an agriculture-based country. The primary sector matters a lot to the country's economy, to the country's export system, and almost all major crops have been destroyed. So the entire cotton crop has been destroyed. So Pakistan exports a lot of cotton. It's one of the few countries that it's one of the few things it's good at, whether it's raw cotton, whether it's cotton products. So if you go to Walmart, if you go to Macy's, there's a very good chance you'll find items such as jeans with the tag made in Pakistan. And so the entire cotton crop is gone. Sugarcane is half of like sugarcane, sesame, tomato, chili, onion. Like these are all things that are used in the staple Pakistani diet. More than half of the crops are gone. The date crop has suffered immensely. Almost all the date trees are essentially submerged. So there's a sort of a massive economic and agricultural hit as well. There's what the WHO has termed as a second disaster that's now happening right now and will continue to exacerbate. So because of lots of water just standing, you have lots of waterborne diseases, mosquito based diseases, so dengue, skin reactions, eye infections, diarrhea. I would say dengue single-handedly is very, very alarming. People have almost forgotten about the pandemic as sort of a health crisis and are now moving on to dengue as a health crisis. So you can imagine dealing with the pandemic and with the dengue issue simultaneously, in addition to the flooding situation. There's sort of an acute gas shortage. Pakistan, unfortunately, relies a lot on fossil fuels. As people use gas to cook, to heat up houses. There's a acute gas shortage. The reason being entire pipelines were just simply washed away by the flooding. There's a petrol crisis as well because the transportation sector was disrupted. Highways were literally blocked, so highways were literally submerged. So there was just no chance of oil tankers bringing the oil to where they were needed. You had railway tracks, infrastructure just underwater, unfortunately. So there was just no way you could travel across the country, especially to the rural areas. Just to sort of wrap up. So as I mentioned, August 25th is the sort of the key date Why is that? Because that was when the government essentially officially recognized the flooding crisis as a sort of a national emergency. And a day before, on August 24th, the government launched an international worldwide appeal. A couple of days after, on August 27th, the government essentially sends in the army to all provinces. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A. So Pakistan, if you follow Pakistani politics, it hasn't historically had a very good democratic record. So what climate crises like floods mean for undermining democracy, for increasing military control where military control shouldn't exist, is an interesting discussion, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. As Brian had mentioned earlier, more than half of the country was underwater at some point. Once Pakistan asked for aid, so you had lots of like multilateral, bilateral aid coming in through lots of channels: UN, EU, Asian Development Bank, US, UK, and a lot of the Muslim countries sort of at the forefront as well. Some sending in supplies, some sending in money, some sending in tents, and so on. But there was a big problem, which I think is not talked about as much openly, which is that right now both the military and the federal government are undergoing a severe trust issue. So remember, I said Pakistan is a federalist country like the US. So right now, actually, the government that's in power at the national level, the government to which the prime minister and the president belong to, actually are in control of none of Pakistan's provincial areas. Zero. It's basically, it's joke that the federal government is essentially the government of Islamabad, which is the capital, because it can exert little to no control outside Islamabad. The sort of the two main provinces, KP, which was one of the provinces that was hardest hit, and Punjab, actually belong to the opposition party, which is right now fighting with the federal government. So this essentially has created a severe trust deficit. Pakistanis, whether local or Pakistanis abroad, they're not trusting the government nor the military to give aid to. They're not trusting that if they give money, if they give aid, if they give products to the government, that aid will reach the right hands. So the question then is that if the Pakistanis themselves are not trusting the government, why should foreigners, why should international agencies, why should other countries trust the government? And I'll give you a specific example. This slightly came out in the example of Canada. So I would like to think Canada is a relatively rich country. It's a well-endowed country. It's a country with resources. Can you guess how much aid Canada gave bilaterally directly to Pakistan? Does someone you want to?
A couple million.
It was actually initially $20,000 only. So I mean, yeah. But you're exactly right. It eventually rose to a couple of million. But the reason it rose to a couple of million was those millions were not given bilaterally to Pakistan. Those millions were actually given to the UN's, I think if I'm getting this right, UN sort of emergency fund, which then gave it to Pakistan with the assumption that I think it would be distributed with UN sort of boots on the ground.
Yeah.
So this sort of like again points to this problem of like, I mean, yeah, $20,000 on one hand being given directly to the government. Yeah, I mean, it's not. I wouldn't even call it a token amount of money. That's yeah. You get the picture.
Omar, I heard you, U.S. only promised 10 million. That's it, right? That's what I heard on NPR.
I'm not sure of the exact amount. I think the US definitely gave more bilaterally than Canada. I think that would be a safe bet. Definitely more than 20,000. You're right. I think it was a relatively generous amount. The US also sent in, I think if I remember correctly, there was a team from USAID that went. Interestingly, the Pentagon also sent its team. So the US military also sent its own team to Pakistan to take stock of the destruction, to sort of assist in ways that the U.S. military could. And I'd be happy to talk more about the U.S.'s specific role in the Q&A. The U.S., the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has had its ups and downs. That's no secret, but the U.S. has definitely been there for Pakistan in sort of these natural emergencies. It was true in the earthquake of 2005 in Pakistan. It was true in the flooding of 2010, and it's true in this year's flooding as well. One approach I'd like to mention is, so again, remember there's
Omar, I had a question.
Sure.
Do you have any more slides to show, or is that the last one?
That's essentially the last one. It's just a few pictures that we
I
can.
just wonder if you could maybe take that off and we can kind of see each other. So
Yes, definitely. Let
Thanks.
me stop share. Is that up?
Yes, thank you. I just like to be able to see people's faces. Hello. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead with what you're saying.
No, I was just gonna say that, and this was actually the last thing on my agenda was, so essentially there's a difference in approach between the respective provinces and the federal government. So remember I mentioned early on that there were massive political upheavals. There was also provincial center disunity, discord, and that's been playing out in how each region, each place is sort of taking its own approach. But one approach I thought that was worthy of being mentioned is actually the approach that the opposition party in the Punjab province is taking, and that essentially it's trying to run these digital surveys. It's sending these teams to these flood-affected areas, trying to take stock of how much destruction has taken place, specifically as far as like families are concerned, how much homes have been damaged and to what extent. It's trying to log that in, trying to digitalize, trying to bring it back together in sort of one central dashboard, and then trying to sort of, based on the GPS coordinates, the extent of flooding, the likelihood of impact, all of those measures, it's trying to give out cash payments as soon as possible. So I don't know what the turnaround is, but once the survey team sort of takes your data, takes the data, it goes back, and essentially the flood affected family gets a text message instructing them which bank branch to go to get their cash payment. It's a great initiative. The problem is if the families have a mobile phone to begin with, but that's, yeah. So it's a promising solution, but then there are also obvious problems. And with that, I'll stop. I think I've blabbered too much. I hope it was helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions.
No, it's been great, and I found it fascinating. I know Dave had his hand up, his digital hand up.
Yeah, so I have to leave in 5 minutes for another meeting, so I wanted to see if I get my comment in. First, thanks, Omar, fantastic presentation. We learned a lot. I just want to say you were generous by thinking that the US was generous in their offer, because when I heard on NPR, first the impact, which was at about $10 billion in damage, that US was pledging 10 million, I was quite embarrassed. So I thought that was a very minuscule amount, more than Canada, but still quite an embarrassing amount. But I maybe understand that because of what's happening in the country, that maybe, you know, the political unrest and everything else is have their little control of what's going on. Maybe that's a reason why they reserve their amount that they pledge.
I think you're absolutely right. You're spot on. It's I think not just I would say not just the US, but even other countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like these, they were just slow to react. And you can probably imagine, so Pakistan itself was slow to react. So it took a month for Pakistan to actually declare all of this as a national emergency. And so, like, imagine like all of these countries reacting after August 25, when August 24th was when Pakistan made the sort of the international appeal. So the reaction time was very slow on the part of Pakistanis, on the Pakistani government. And you're right, it was also slow and somewhat lethargic on the part of the international community, especially the countries that are sort of well resourced. And yeah, but again, you're right in the sense that even after the slow reaction times, the amounts that were then given were not necessarily too generous. And so it's hopefully they'll change. I mean, the aftermath of the crisis is still very much happening. So we can only hope, but yes, that was unfortunate. I'm not sure who.
Camille, I think you're next. Don't forget to unmute.
Sorry. So I had two questions. One was, is there any idea how long it's going to be that you have to suffer through this? And the other one was, we're encountering a lot of people who say, oh, well, this is a monsoon, it's a natural thing, it's not really related to climate change, etc. So we're I've heard that a number of times. So yeah, those two points.
Thank you for those questions, first of all. Yeah, like that's the first question is difficult to predict. Thankfully, the waters have receded. The sort of the flow in the rivers is becoming normalized. But then, I mean, there are lots of areas where water is still standing. Even if the water has receded, the areas are severely waterlogged. So, like for instance, I might have mentioned this to Brian in our conversation earlier today as well. Like, so now is the time that is coming for the farmers to start planting wheat, which is a winter crop. And they cannot do that because the land is just too waterlogged for anything to be done. And so not just the crops, it's not just a matter of the crops that have been destroyed by or swept away by the water in the previous weeks, but a matter of future sort of crops and harvests also not being able to come through. So at least for the foreseeable future, you could say, I mean, the crop situation till spring is hopeless. And then you can sort of multiply that effect by I mean, the fact that, as I said, like Pakistan is an agricultural country. Lots of people depend on agriculture, whether it's subsistence farming or whether it's for export. So both at a local level and at a national level, this is just going to turn into sort of a multiplier effect. It's going to, thinking about that 100-kilometer lake, I mean, there are lots of areas like that. And so there's no going back for if you're someone who used to live there. So now it's a question of where do you go next? Do you stay in the cities? You move to a different city? Do you move to a different rural area? There's a lot of ethnicity and power politics at play as well. So you just cannot, unfortunately, get up and walk to a different part of the country. So unfortunately, this is just sort of going to continue for the next few months at the very least. Regarding your second question was about why this is specifically a climate change related.
I want to just make sure that we can grasp that this is something that we don't want to have happen again. It's not just a typical monsoon. It's because of the glacial melt and, so something that we can fight against. A monsoon we can't, but this glacial disaster, perhaps we can avoid it.
So yes, I think there can definitely be better water management. I think this is maybe one area where the US can play a role in, whether it's building dams or using the dams for hydroelectricity as well, which is a discussion which we didn't get into, to sort of move away from the oil and gas. So better, I think, dam management, better infrastructure. And then, I mean, the biggest glacier, I think one of the biggest glaciers in the world, some of you might be familiar with this, is the Siachen Glacier, where India and Pakistan are actually fighting a war since '84. And the one direct impact of the war that is and I use the term war because it is active conflict. One direct impact of that is related to climate change, with thousands of soldiers on that glacier from both countries. You can imagine the impact, I mean, the human lifestyle is having on accelerating the glacial melt. So that is just like one example of us just not taking care of the glaciers and just accelerating the whole process. So yeah, this is like an area where there's lots of scope for international support. This is potentially an area where both the US and China can come together and sort of collaborate. But I guess,
but it's not just a natural progression, like something that people are saying, oh, well, it's normal that this is going to happen. It isn't, right? Because it's from climate.
Yes. It's definitely not normal. As I mentioned, like we're not even used to 3 to 4 monsoon cycles a year. This year it was 8 monsoon cycles, and there's no guarantee that next year it won't be 16.
Right.
So yes, this is, and I might be pessimistic, but I just don't see this improving moving forward. It's anything, it's only going to worsen.
Thank you very much.
And Omar, I think you said that in some parts of the country that the rainfall was up to 8 times as much as normal, 800% or 8 times as much. Is that right?
Yes.
So it's definitely not just the monsoon. Something's changed.
Yes.
And it's
I mean,
fueling the rainfall.
The 800% is in Sindh province, where I'm from. It's usually a dry province. It's not sort of a wet province. It's not the wettest province of Pakistan even. As I said, like, I mean, I grew up praying for more rainfall, because at best in Karachi we'd get 1-2 weeks of rainfall. Now we're talking about praying for the rain to stop. So you can imagine sort of where the situation was 15 years ago and where it is right now. So definitely, I mean, this ideally wasn't supposed to happen. And yeah, it's the same thing with like the 3 to 4 monsoon cycles turning into 8 monsoon cycles. Like the 800%, unfortunately, is only going to blow up even more. So it's contradictory to so there has to be a better sense of managing that 800% of rainfall, because Pakistan, this might sound like a paradox, but is also, I think, one of the top 3 or top 5 countries that is sort of going to be the most water scarce country in the world. That is almost laughable compared to how much water there is in the country right now. But like along with Yemen, like Pakistan is going to be one of those countries hardest hit by water scarcity. So there has to be something that can be done, that 800%, that 600%, 500% increases in rainfall can be sort of conserved, so that we don't get to a point where we are begging for water. So yeah, it's
all the extremes in both direction get exacerbated.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask, you're a political scientist, and kind of going back to Brian's question at the very beginning, or his hope, I guess you might call it, that with greater climate disasters will come greater awareness and greater public demand for change. But it seems like it's also possible that the impact of climate disasters, especially, you know, at the kind of local or you know, small country, Pakistan's not a small country, but at the regional level, the impact may be just chaos and political upheaval and, you know, warring factions and, you know, blame games and economic collapse. And those things don't seem to be a good recipe for organizing a nice clean energy infrastructure and cooperative, you know, transition to a new green economy. So I just wonder, kind of, how do you fall on that? Are you optimistic that people are waking up to the need for climate action, or is, are we going to be kind of overrun by disasters before we can get organized to stop it?
I'm usually a pessimistic person, so I'll start off with that. But surprisingly, Pakistanis can be
I think he's frozen.
Hmm.
Omar, I don't know if you can hear us, but, oh, there you go. I can hear you
You
now.
were frozen for a few seconds there.
oh
Sorry.
am I audible now?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying that surprisingly, Pakistanis can be quite progressive when they choose to be, and climate change, again, surprisingly, has been one of those areas where they've chosen to be progressive. So even, I mean, this was a surprise to me. I was just there in Pakistan, like at the household level, at least, like people have been installing like the private solar panels. This is of course like a move that is being done by upper middle class households. It will take a long time for this to get to the areas in, let's say, Sindh and the Northwest that have been impacted by floods, that can really do with such initiatives. But at least like something is better than nothing. I think at the end of the day, it just comes to a matter of survival, and a matter of like how you're organizing those different priorities, the different issues that I mentioned. Unfortunately, like in the Northwest that has been severely hit by flooding, there's, I mean, again, a real chance of terrorism. So like if you're a local, you end up thinking like, how do I survive today? If the threat is of me being drowned, then climate change is going to be my priority today. If the threat is me being shot at, then terrorism is going to be my priority today. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but for the foreseeable future, that is just going to keep changing. It's in Pakistan has usually been good with sort of top-down measures where the government, the federal government, the provincial governments really have to lead the way, really have to take a stand. And unless that disunity, that political discord goes away, those sort of ethnic distrust goes away, this will just be sort of we'll see a repeat of this, where we'll see the major crises, all the Pakistani nation coming together. Oh, this is sort of such a tragic event. We should really do something about it. We should really
And
argue
just
about
a
it.
quick follow-up. Did you sense when you were there that people, if they understand this as a climate disaster, do they blame the West? Do they blame the big emitters? We're the biggest historically, the biggest carbon emitter. China's now up there. Do they blame those big rich countries for all the pollution that they're now suffering the effects of, or is it not? Do they not conceptualize it that way?
I think so. There's at least in the urban areas, there's a good understanding of climate change, and such events, such crises are linked to climate change. That this is a direct impact of climate related issues, whether it's more rainfall, heat waves, different climate, different weather, so on and so forth. I will say that while Pakistanis find a whole bunch of reasons to blame the US for, climate change hasn't been one of those reasons so far. But if you guys want
A
to
wasted opportunity.
if you guys are eager to add that to the list, I think Pakistanis would be very happy, trust me. So yeah, I think it's more of an lack of understanding that, and I was just reading this quote by sort of someone who was impacted by the current crises, that, I mean, most of these people have hardly sat in cars. Almost none of them have flown. Like even a car journey is sort of a big deal for them. So there's very little understanding of, first of all, what exactly is carbon itself, let alone carbon emitters, or like who's doing most of the emitting. Is it the US, China? So I think there's still a long way to go in that education part. Again, that has to come from the government. Otherwise, it's we're just going to be at the same place next year.
Carol, you had your hand up.
Yes, it occurs to me that if we're going to hold the corporations responsible for the climate crisis, we also need to be calling on them in situations like Pakistan to be providing humanitarian aid. And it should not just be it shouldn't be just the governments expected to provide assistance, but the corporations, and we should be calling on Chase to respond to the crisis
That's a good point.
in Pakistan.
Yeah, Chase has $2.5 trillion in assets, a lot more than 20,000 or 10 million.
They could easily give 10 million.
I think that's,
Or a
that's
billion.
a great point.
That's
Great.
right.
But there's
I wanted to clarify that I wasn't hoping for a worldwide disaster to motivate the work, get the world organized. I was just
Sure.
gloomily feeling like possibly that's the only thing, since nothing else has worked so far on a wide enough level, that some incredible disaster may be the only thing that will light a fire under people worldwide. But I'm certainly not hoping for that. Anyway, does somebody else have any questions?
I have a
Jeff?
question. Another question. I have one little question. If we were to get Chase or other people to donate, is there, where would you say is the best place or to give?
donate specifically to Pakistan.
Yeah,
I mean, given that trust-like deficit that, and this is just like my personal view, I think a lot of Pakistanis are preferring private NGOs, private charities, rather than the government. So there are private NGOs. I think I'm happy to pass on. I mean, I don't necessarily endorse those private NGOs, but they're the ones who I've heard. I haven't seen myself, so I can't personally vouch, but I've heard that they're sort of doing good stuff. They're doing initiatives on the ground, but like Khidmat Foundation is one.
what
There's
about Médecins Sans Frontières, that one? Médecins Sans Frontières or?
I'm sure,
Doctors
yes,
Without
I
Borders.
think they should be involved.
Yeah, IRC.
IRC is involved. So they're both, you're right, international and local NGOs. They're usually a safer bet than the government. I remember there was a colleague here at Brown who used to work in UN OCHA, which is the Office for Coordination of Civil Military Affairs. And yeah, this was a recurring theme that even the UN preferred dealing with either with private NGOs or preferred handing out the provisions themselves, just because
Right.
it's the government is just an untrustworthy.
Well, if you
entity.
could pass that on, that would be something perhaps we could work on a little bit.
Sure, I'll definitely make a note of this and be sure.
Thanks.
Last
Well,
question, Jeff?
Yeah, one is really interesting. I actually have, too many questions, but when Brian introduced you, he said you were doing research on interstate conflict. With climate, there's all these models and predictions that relate to the physical world, the increase in temperature and flooding, but I do have a sense that climate change and the disruption in these disasters and population displacements are going to lead to a lot of interstate conflict. It sounds like what you're saying, that in Pakistan, it can be not interstate, but interregion. But I don't know, do you have any sense of, are there any people predicting or trying to model more interstate conflict due to climate change and climate disruption? Or do you work on that? Or because it sounds like, there's this idea that the Syrian civil war came after the worst drought, 5-year drought in Syrian history, and they have a long history. And so even there, climate might have been part of the reason that there was this horrible civil war. Anyway, just wondering what your thoughts on that.
That's a really interesting question, and yeah, I wow, that's hopefully a new research project for me. It's unfortunately there's a risk of both. Pakistanis, we love to fight, whether it's with others or amongst ourselves. The water conflict to some extent is actually related to India as well. So if you try to remember that the map of the rivers that I showed you, the eastern rivers are actually originating from India. So what usually happens is, and what has happened in the past and what India threatens to do is basically in the dry seasons, India says we're going to block the supply of water to Pakistan. And in the monsoon seasons, we're going to lift the water, basically flooding Pakistan. And so that's the potential risk of conflict over that, because imagine in such a scenario, July, August 2022, when all of this is happening in Pakistan, and on top of that, India decides to release water from its end. That will totally, I mean, right now, half of the country was underwater. If India does that, 3/4 of the country will be underwater. So you can see how that might lead to interstate conflict. Intrastate conflict, I wouldn't say there's a chance for like open conflict, like a civil war, but conflict more in terms of like disagreements, just not sharing the appropriate resources. So like if you're talking about Punjab, where the Punjabi ethnic group is dominant, and let's say you have IDPs coming from some of the other provinces, they might not necessarily be as welcome over there. They might not receive the same treatment that IDPs from within that province are receiving. So you might have like these sort of tussles. And of course, this can get ugly if armed groups start to sort of have a go at each other. One armed group saying, vote for us in the next elections. We're going to fight for you right now. Make sure you get your deserved share of aid. And so basically armed clientelism, which is sort of a favorite term of political scientists. There's a good chance for like not open conflict, but like these hidden battles, these hidden tussles. And at the end of the day, it's just the ordinary people who are going to suffer, whether it's interstate conflict or a civil war like situation. So all in all, a very messy situation.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think we should thank our speaker for the
Thank
very
you.
informative presentation.
Thank you so much for being such lovely audiences, and for it takes a lot of willpower to hear me keep on talking for. So,
Not at
You're a
all.
good speaker.
Yeah,
We
it was
enjoyed
great.
it. I'd like to do one last pitch for next Saturday, the 29th. And we're protesting in solidarity with the people of Pakistan and terrible things that have happened there, and that are not normal, and that are largely because of climate change. So hope you'll join us next Saturday. We're meeting at noon at the CVS on 3rd Street. And that's it.
Well, I hope we can get some money from people over here, over there. So I'm looking forward to your ideas.
Brian has my email, and in fact, I'll share it over here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I wasn't able to get to or that might come later. And I'll be sure to pass the information to Brian if he can disperse it to the group. But in case you have any questions, other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Again, it's such a wonderful opportunity, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
And we'll see if we can't get Chase Bank and maybe Exxon both to throw in $1 billion to Pakistan. Not too likely, but we'll try.